The insolvency of a currency begins with a political miscalculation and culminates in a brutal physical manifestation. In 2018, the Central Bank of Venezuela estimated the annual inflation rate at 1,700,000%. This figure is not a theoretical construct. It is the irrefutable evidence that the core fiduciary pact was permanently altered. Venezuela did not fail due to a lack of subterranean wealth. It succumbed to an acute excess of manufactured liquidity. When the state, facing an inability to generate sustainable revenue or implement expenditure cuts, utilizes the instrument of the printing press as its ultimate policy of survival, money ceases to be a reservoir of value and becomes the mechanism of its own demise. The administrative solution to the crisis became, ironically, the primary cause of the systemic decay: printing more bolivars. The immediate outcome was the subtle mathematical expropriation of national patrimony. There was no need for formal seizure or physical confiscation, only the systematic arithmetical dilution of an entire nation's collective effort. The humiliation reached its apex. Transporting the sheer volume of paper currency required to purchase a kilogram of flour demanded more physical effort than the caloric value of the commodity itself. This is the exhaustive study of a sovereign entity that traded fiscal responsibility for the illusion of perpetual power, transforming paper into refuse and trust into ash. This is Venezuela, where the burden of exchange physically outweighed the sustenance it secured. Here, at the macro threshold, your intelligence front dedicated to tracking the structural fractures beneath market narratives, we dissect precisely how a nation with the world's largest verified petroleum reserves could orchestrate its own fiscal execution. In 2 minutes, you will understand the operational architecture of monetary collapse, differentiating between mere economic downturn and absolute administrative failure. The Venezuela case study is crucial because it illustrates the definitive stages of currency destruction, a playbook too often attempted, rarely to this calamitous degree. Our initial assessment requires us to recognize the fundamental paradox of subterranean wealth. Venezuela's economy, designed primarily as a petrostate, meant that national economic planning was structurally held hostage by geology and global commodity cycles. The vast oil revenue, while superficially indicating strength, fostered a profound structural vulnerability, an acute dependency on non-recurrent revenues to finance fundamentally recurrent, long-term political liabilities, specifically massive social engineering programs. During the era of elevated oil prices, the state utilized this windfall as a mechanism for short-term political stability and immediate consumption, rather than strategic economic diversification or the establishment of robust sovereign wealth funds. This period, which we designate as Phase 1, the era of fiscal illusion, was characterized by abundant yet entirely artificial liquidity. The revenue influx masked the total absence of fiscal discipline. Cash flow was ample, so the necessary conversation about sustainable debt rollovers, revenue diversification, and expenditure management was systematically deferred. The state achieved a false sense of solvency, essentially spending $1 billion today without any mechanism to guarantee the recurring income needed to maintain the new inflated standard of expenditure tomorrow. This created a political covenant with the population that was structurally unsupportable once the external cash flow diminished. The nation was building a permanent consumption structure on a temporary revenue stream. Mark this down. When the commodity cycle inevitably reversed, the government faced a brutal financial gap. They had committed to salaries, subsidies, and social programs that required massive, reliable inflows of hard currency. When the oil revenue faucet tightened, the political commitment remained inelastic. This is where the collapse shifts from an economic challenge to an administrative decision. The state entered Phase 2, administrative survival. As oil production and tax receipts plummeted, removing the primary sources of sovereign financing, the government institutionally chose the printing mechanism as the only viable policy to meet its political commitments and avoid immediate, widespread social unrest. We must explain the covenant of the technique before we judge the outcome. The government, unable to collect sufficient taxes or issue debt into functioning capital markets, effectively sells its debt directly to the central bank. This process, monetary base expansion, is the institutional replacement of fiscal revenue with raw sovereign liquidity. The central bank, in this scenario, ceases to function as an independent monetary authority and becomes the administrative cash register of the executive branch. This deliberate expansion of the money supply was not an error of forecasting. It was a strategic choice for administrative continuity, valuing the short-term maintenance of power over the long-term solvency of the national currency. The catalytic contagion event occurred decisively in 2014. The global drop in commodity prices eviscerated the last robust source of hard currency. This sudden contraction removed the capacity of the state not only to fund its domestic liabilities with foreign currency, but, crucially, to manage essential imports, food, medicine, and industrial components. The collapse in hard currency reserves directly impacted the availability of goods, supply shock, while the accelerating domestic money supply chased fewer and fewer products, demand shock. The structural fragility was instantly exposed, forcing monetary financing to transition from being merely an option to becoming the only immediate means of avoiding an outright state budget closure. At this point, the economy entered phase 3, hyper-contagion. The public, observing the accelerating prices and the government's evident inability to stop the printing, drastically increased the velocity of money, the rate at which currency changes hands. Individuals realized that holding the local bolivar guaranteed a daily loss of wealth. Their rational response was to immediately dispose of bolivars in favor of any physical asset, durable good, or hard foreign currency, further compressing the time available before the currency became worthless. This feedback loop is the signature of hyperinflation, a self-fulfilling prophecy of fiduciary destruction. The ultimate, promised Phase 4, which Venezuela is still negotiating, is the unofficial forced dollarization or the complete institutional restructuring of the monetary base after the collapse. Hold that thought. The transition from Phase 2 to Phase 3 is the moment the administrative decision creates a self-sustaining physical pathology in the real economy. Up to this point, we have analyzed the policy failure and the mechanical cause, the systematic replacement of fiscal revenue with central bank expansion. Now comes the humiliating part, the physical pathology of currency. The 1,700,000% inflation rate means that the population experienced the systematic dilution of their stored wealth through mathematical erosion. To anchor this macro concept personally, your life savings, which required decades of labor and deferred consumption, could lose half their value not over a year, but sometimes over a single week. The currency ceased to fulfill its core function as a reliable store of value or a unit of account. Furthermore, the sheer weight and volume of the currency required to complete basic transactions meant that the cost of exchange, the transportation, counting, and storage of the currency, became a significant, quantifiable economic burden. Store clerks often required multiple counting machines or simply weighed bales of currency rather than counting individual notes, confirming that the medium of exchange had devolved into mere paper mass. The currency was not a mechanism for facilitated trade. It was a physical impediment to survival. The legacy of permanent alteration is clear. Venezuela is the definitive, sobering case study of how a catastrophic political misjudgment manifests as acute physical and systemic economic disorder. The nation did not lose its potential wealth. The oil reserves remained. It lost the collective confidence in the medium of exchange. This lost confidence is a structural fracture far harder to repair than any budget deficit. The structural provocation remains. Where else, across the global south or even the leveraged developed world, is the administrative policy of monetary survival silently enacting a permanent alteration on a nation's future value? The money supply was expanded because the state refused to acknowledge the fundamental mathematical truth of its own budget. The ultimate truth of administrative collapse is not the lack of resources, but the sovereign rejection of responsibility for the cash flow necessary to sustain political ambition. When the state trades its fiduciary responsibility for immediate political utility, the only available collateral is the collective effort of its citizens, systematically diluted. The administrative elite achieved temporary political stability by burning the foundation of the currency, ensuring that the burden of the state's insolvency was paid not by its architects, but by the population, through the painful physical surrender of their monetary value. We must then ask the surgical question: if a sovereign currency fails to function, if the fiduciary pact is permanently altered, and if the state cannot fiscally survive without the printing press, then in whose vault is the nation's monetary sovereignty truly held? Up to this point, we've mapped the vicious cycle of administrative bankruptcy, where Venezuela, confronted with the erosion of its fiscal base, turned to monetary expansion as its only survival policy, preserving immediate political stability at the cost of incinerating the foundations of its currency. Now comes the uncomfortable part: the surgical coldness of the real economy. Hyperinflation, as a mechanism of mass destruction of saved wealth, is never universally destructive. For some, it becomes a window of extraordinary leverage and capital accumulation. If the reserve currency inside the system is being destroyed, someone must be positioned to convert that destruction into tangible assets, or hard currency. This is where we introduce the true systemic villain, dry powder. Dry powder, in the context of a collapsing economy, isn't the capital that fled. It's the capital that stayed, strategically positioned to execute the final wealth transfer. This capital is almost always domestic, politically connected, and granted preferential access to the scarcest assets in the system: hard currency and import licenses. While the average citizen watched their wages melt in real time, insiders were engaged in the most profitable economic activity available: arbitrage across multiple artificial exchange rates. The mechanism operated with ruthless simplicity, and this is the covenant that defines collapse. The government, desperate to preserve even the appearance of control, created official exchange rates dramatically overvaluing the bolivar, rates typically reserved for essential imports, like food and medicine, or more often for goods brought in by state entities and their partners. At the same time, the parallel market, driven by distrust and by the real-world need for dollars to transact value, set the only exchange rate that mattered, the true price of the currency, often 10, 100, or 1,000 times higher. Dry powder didn't need productivity or innovation, it needed access. If an individual or a company obtained through political channels the right to purchase $1 million at the official rate, say 10 bolivars per dollar, and could immediately sell that same dollar on the parallel market at 1,000 bolivars per dollar, the profit was instant, guaranteed, and exponential. This operation, regulatory capture paired with the immediate conversion of subsidized currency into real wealth, became the primary engine of capital accumulation. The monetary crisis turned into a subsidy machine for the elite, where the only productive advantage was proximity to the state vault. The central bank stopped functioning as a monetary authority and became an allocator of scarcity, effectively the largest and most efficient wealth transfer mechanism in the country as to recent history. Remember this: the final strike, and the most cruel, was the socialization of the loss. Monetizing the government deficit did not punish those responsible for expanding the monetary base, nor the elite extracting profits through arbitrage. The damage was absorbed almost entirely by working families, retirees, and anyone holding assets denominated in bolivars. By injecting fiat liquidity to pay wages and satisfy political obligations, the state ensured that everyone's purchasing power collapsed violently. Money, supposed to be a right and a store of value, became a regressive inflation tax collected every hour of the average citizen's life. And the administrative tragedy didn't stop at the currency. It culminated in the destruction of the nation's physical infrastructure. Hyperinflation doesn't just collapse money, it collapses the logistical and operational systems that money supports. The inability to generate real fiscal revenue meant basic services, electricity, water, public health care, began to fail. The monetary collapse triggered an unprecedented diaspora of skilled labor. Venezuela exported its human capital, its technical competence, and its productive capacity, leaving behind a poorer social base increasingly dependent on state subsidies financed by the printing press. This is the price of trading fiscal discipline for political survival. A state rich in natural resources, but structurally bankrupt in administration and trust. The key question for us at Macro Threshold is this: what is the long-term cost to a sovereign nation that administratively chose to destroy its own currency? The cost is the loss of control over its own assets. A permanent break in the fiduciary pact creates a vacuum of monetary and economic authority, one that inevitably attracts external interests with capital and military power to fill it. When external debt becomes unpayable, especially to geopolitically motivated creditors like China and Russia, who accepted oil-backed guarantees, and the state fails to efficiently monetize its last remaining asset, oil, due to administrative negligence and an inability to invest in production, the geopolitical equation changes. What used to be sovereign assets become distressed assets, ready to be extracted. Venezuela isn't merely a case study in hyperinflation. It is a case study in the economic subordination of a nation to external creditors and regional powers, driven by its own internal insolvency. The country now sits on the front line of a new Cold War over resources, where internal administrative collapse becomes a formal invitation for external intervention. Remember this: the price of administrative neglect and a survival strategy built on destroying the currency is the imminent loss of the ability to determine its own destiny. The economic power vacuum in Latin America, where the world's largest proven oil reserves sit, is not sustainable in a world driven by energy transition and resource competition. The collapse of the bolivar created an opening for others to control the wealth source the government failed to manage. So the question that defines the next chapter of this crisis is direct and brutally pragmatic. Venezuela's operational collapse created a geopolitical liability too large to ignore. What happens when the creditors of a bankrupt nation, backed by military and economic power, finally decide to execute their guarantees on the country's most valuable resource, oil? And what happens when Venezuela's administrative insolvency is directly confronted by Washington's strategic ambitions, and by Beijing and Moscow's need to recover credit, turning an internal monetary collapse into a geopolitical theater of operations? That is the dilemma we will break down next, when the United States takes control of Venezuela, oil, debt, and the confrontation with China.